James is going to be talking about Robert Kroetsch
Yeah.
while we eat mango waffle, and he's drinking apple and celery juice, and I'm having hot lime and honey. A good breakfast, and it's with the oatmeal waffles, but I can't get the
Topped with mangoes, right?
yes, I can't get the Bob's Red Mill steel cut oats at Superstore, and the steel cut oats that they have at Superstore are packaged in a small container, and they're very expensive. So I get the large flake oats from there when I get oats from them lately.
Yeah, it makes an attractive looking waffle. A different kind of texture.
And then I just grind it up in the food processor. Into a flour.
The apple almost hides the taste of the
Celery.
celery. That's hard.
Yeah, James doesn't like celery juice very much.
Well, I like celery, but
Yeah, but not
the juice is pretty bitter. It's amazing how different juice is from, like, I kind of like cooked beets, but beet juice is wow. And kale is tough, but kale juice is almost as bad as dandelion juice. So don't get the wrong impression. I'm licking my lips, but that's just so I don't have a green mustache. So I don't look like a
Well,
alien
go ahead
from
with
Mars.
your book.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Whatever
I
you
thought you
want.
might have something
No.
more significant to talk about than this book. Robert Kroetsch. This is one of my brushes with greatness. I'll show you what he looked like back in the day. Not when I met him, but this would have been, this picture might date from 20 years after. So this book was published, I believe, in 1995. Let me just check. 1995. Okay, and it's a likely story, is subtitled The Writing Life. It's not a writing life, but the writing life. So what does he say? I am attempting to write an autobiography in which I do not appear. So this is kind of like an autobiography. These things, judging from one of the things in the back, one of the sections in the back, under acknowledgments, he goes into detail about how these different parts that make up the whole were presented or published in various places or with various publishing companies and stuff like that. And so it looks as though he just kind of scrabbled together things from different sources and said, okay, this is my attempt at an autobiography. So it's, I don't know. I guess you can kind of do that when you're, or you kind of do that when you're taking from your journals or something like that, or your diaries. So maybe it's not that bad an approach. Anyway, my brush with greatness, he was something like the writer in in residence, because I think he was living a whole lot higher on the hop than having to live in res. And it would have been, I think, roughly the spring of 1976. So I'd started writing poetry kind of semi-officially, maybe in the fall of 75. And I knew the guy who was the editor of Junction. That was the literary, not supplement so much as section of the Meliors, which was the student newspaper. It still is the student newspaper at the University of Lethbridge. And so I knew this guy. I think eventually I became editor of Junction, something like that. And, well, it was quite early, really. So did this guy, Y. Chan was his name, had he, yeah, he'd kind of given up. Maybe he never was editor of Junction, but he was getting together poetry readings. And so he got hold of this one guy, Ron Fazio, really good poet. A year younger than me. I thought he was significantly younger, but it turns out I think only a year younger. And then he was saying, "Hey, Ron's doing a reading. Do you want to fill out the ticket, as it were?" You know, so I was kind of like the vice president for Ron's president, and it was kind of embarrassing because Ron was so much better than me back then, and you know, I've written maybe a couple of things in the style that he was writing, which was much improved Walt Whitman, shall we say. But you know, like I saw him recently, he was saying, you know, something like on his bucket list. He wasn't saying bucket list. He didn't say before I wanted to write a sonnet. Okay, yeah, I've written so many sonnets and stuff like that. Of course, it'd be hard to recognize them as sonnets because what I do is I cut the lines up and make them into songs as well.
So far, I think writing sonnets are my favorite.
Yeah, and I've had you do the same sort of thing as exercises, right? But you've done, you've excelled at doing them, so they're not exercise. You're actually filling the forms with content. And so actually, I'd say Pauline has surpassed this Ron Fazio overall as a poet. Anyway, it was embarrassing to be on the same ticket as him back then. I was just starting off, as it were. And I was writing stuff that kind of like loose essentials. At least that was the stuff that I had, that I was reading. I was working on stuff where it was what they call essential syllabic.
And so far, my least favorite to write is, or have been, I can't remember what they're called, but the
Villanelle?
Chinese,
Oh,
no, those
that's
are
right. Yeah.
interesting to write, but
They are interesting. They're kind of tough.
Yeah. But no, the Chinese she form.
Okay.
Stuff,
Yeah.
is anyway.
I've had Pauline write
With
lots
the
of
level
form.
tone opening.
Lots of different things from forms, theoretically, from around the world. You kind of adapt them for English prosody and so on and so forth. Pauline's learned a lot last year. So, Robert Kroetsch was in the audience at this reading. And they generally ask Ron things. I mean, it's more interesting to ask something if someone's actually got shtick. But Robert Kroetsch asked me a question. He possibly felt a certain degree of sympathy or something like that. I mean, we all start off somewhere. He asked me a question. He said, "So you're writing," and he had somewhat of an ear. You know, you're writing couplets and stuff like that. So rhymed couplets. They were kind of loose, accentual rhymed couplets. And he seemed like a very decent man. You know, just kind of kind. You know. But then he was kind of paid to do that, right? So this is the first of his stuff. He could be long dead. I'd like to think he's alive, but he'd be, I think, born in 1927. So he'd be almost as old as my dad, like 4 years younger. The Kroetsch would be something like 94 if he's still alive. He comes from Alberta. It must be somewhere near Camrose or something like that. Somewhere south and east of Edmonton. Probably south of Camrose. So, I'm reading the story, or not story, it's a purported autobiography. And I'm going, another Canadian public intellectual. One of the sections in here, he's dealing with Robert Enright. And you've heard that Sheila Rogers and her pretentious voice. The most pretentious voice I think I've ever heard on CBC is Robert Enright. He's retired. He has this big, plummy kind of voice. He's hanging with Robert Enright, and they're testing wines. Is it in Paris or something like that? I can't remember. And they run across some fantabulous wine. And Enright both times, this on separate occasions, might have been the same evening, he's got to get up and phone this CBC, presumably about how fantastic wine is. I don't know if he's thought of an idea for a story, but it's ridiculous. So, I was thinking to myself, this guy's a prairie boy. And I'm going, like, writing about the prairie, about other things. What kind of a real job did this guy ever have in his life? University educated. Where was it? I think University of Alberta, and then University of, for Pete's sake, Iowa. You think he could have changed, like the landscape? It's just it would have been corn instead of wheat. And he was saying at the University of Iowa, I believe it was the smell of pig poop was all pervading. Iowa. That must have been in Ames. So it's a bucolic little place. It's not even like a Des Moines. Is that how they say it? It means the monks in French. Des Moines is how you should say it, roughly. You'll pardon my mispronunciation. But the Americans don't have much sense for languages other than English. Some people cynically would remark that they don't have much sense for pronouncing English. But that would be altogether too British to say. Yeah, I'm reading this. I whipped through it in less than 24 hours. It's easy reading. I'm sure for most people it wouldn't be. He's throwing out a lot of words. No, there's one thing, a poem. It's an elegy for, he doesn't call it an elegy, he calls it a poem for my dead sister. He wrote it right after her sister died. Maybe he started writing it as she was dying. She died of cancer. I don't want anyone writing poetry like this for me when I die. It's terrible.
Because it's terrible poetry?
It's terrible. I can kind of call it poetry.
You'd like people writing good poetry, though, when you die.
If they really feel it, I don't know if this guy was really feeling it. See, Beelzebub, one of the flies, and Flibberjab. One is insect, one is gab. One is mote in motor's eye. Eye is spelled like I, nay or I. One is how to say goodbye. What, is that the Flibberjab? One, a will is, so there's some inversion. There's lots of inversion in here. I think it's trying for some sort of effect. One and a cow and cat at water trough. So it's rhymed somewhat out to the one mode. Much of it reads just like it's like bad Beverly or something like that. I gotta say, I expected more from the guy. You know, because I kind of got a warm feeling in my heart for him. But he's a Canadian public intellectual. So much of this stuff is about why I went up north and what I found when he got there. Okay, that's pretty sharp kind of title. He's looking at himself when he was young, starting off in his career. And it's hard not to objectify yourself, you know, when you look at your younger self, you know. Why I went up north and what I found when he got there.
It probably is more appropriate to look at it that way, actually.
Well, we all do it.
Because when you're a different person, as
it seems that way.
Yeah, than you were when you were younger, and I mean, you can sort of reconstruct what you were thinking better than perhaps you could reconstruct what other people might have been thinking when.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. So, I don't know.
Anyway, I wanted to write a manifesto. Have you ever wanted to write a manifesto? I think this is a poetic manifesto. I don't think I ever wanted to write a manifesto. The cow in the quicksand and how it, or I, you know, he's got the T in brackets, got out, responding to Stegner's Wolf Willow. Stegner's Wolf Willow I quite like. Playing Dead and Rudy Weeb's Playing Dead, a reader's marginalia. So that's full of puns on margin, right? Marginalized, margin. No, I don't like that term, marginalized. It's so misused, frankly, abused nowadays by the whole bullshit. Lonesome Rider Diptych, Family Reunion, a cowboy poem. That one's actually pretty good. It was written for something like a family reunion. Kind of like a reasonably literate cowboy poem. D-Day and After, so that's D-Day in World War II. So this guy experienced that. He wasn't in World War II. He was just a little bit too young, thank heavens for him, to have to go over there, or over wherever. Remembering a scrapbook I cannot find. Sitting down to write Margaret Lawrence and the Discourse of Mourning. Oh no, discourse. You notice how we got manifesto and discourse, and this is just in the title. Poem from my dead sister, the poetics. Oh no, poetics. Rita Kleinhardt, and then acknowledgments. So I'm reading this, and I'm reading all sorts of things like discourse, references to Michel Foucault, or at least one. A reference to Bakhtin or Bakhtin, however you pronounce his name or mispronounce his name. Yeah, this guy got training in English and in philosophy, and the philosophy creeps through. He says here, I am attempting to write an autobiography in which I do not appear. Well, I appears in here plenty enough. He does have, this is like 26 years ago for me, a little too often I'd like. But what really gets my goat is, we do this, we do that, right? When we do this, we do this. Have you ever run across that? Yeah. It's what I call Vatic vainglory, you know, like, or Vatic vanity or something like that. He's talking about human beings, you know, as though he knows them all. And I'm afraid it's what philosophers tend to do. Another thing he likes doing, to do this or to be this is to be this. You ever run across that? To do this is to be this. He has the philosopher's thing, is, you know, like, he's got those verbs in there, but he has to have the is. Something is something. He uses that thing. And the public intellectuals love this. At once A and B. Or if they're actually being a little more poetic, well, a little less obviously poetic, and a little more in practice, or praxis, as they might say, poetic, they would use both. If you run across that, they'll say, "This is at once harrowing and soothing." It's oftentimes a way of introducing some sort of paradox. You run across that form, and where I run into it more often than not, and literally more often than not, because I read blurbs. Thank you.
Wow, that one was aiming for you.
Mm-hmm. Almost. With a warning, don't criticize Canadian public lit.
No, I was. I accidentally picked a bunch of goutweed this morning.
Okay.
This, you probably recognize this if I show you this.
Mm-hmm.
It goes as a ground cover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goutweed.
And I have some that's not variegated in the yard too, and I don't know which I prefer.
I like that variegated sort of thing.
But yeah, because I was dragging the sprinkler and it all came up, so I was like, oh, I'll talk about that at another day.
Mm-hmm.
Goutweed. It has nothing to do with Robert Kroetsch.
Anyway, if you're actually being a poet and you're trying to economize, that's one of the things you should be doing, you'll use both. You see my point? Mm-hmm. It's a lot more homely, shall we say. I'm not talking about ugly. It's just something, it's just the way ordinary people do. You don't hear people out in the street. Like there was a fire yesterday in the neighborhood. People weren't out in the street saying, "It's at once glorious and tragic." You know, they weren't talking that way at once. You know? Mm-hmm. But people could say, "Well, it was both glorious and tragic." See how that, you know, like when you do this kind of pompous, it's not just pompous words, it's like pompous locutions and things like that. It's more like a rhetoric.
Yeah.
It doesn't endear you to people, and
No.
it doesn't, you know, when I mean endear, they don't want to return to the thing.
No, it's actually, it's trained aggression. What it is you're trying to hold your audience for as long as possible. So you're trying to force them to sit and listen to you.
Exactly right. So this guy talks about when he decided to be a writer. And then he talks about it, I am a poet, you know, I'm a poet, the poet. You ever heard me say, yeah, I might have let it slip or something like that, but it would not be letting it slip because I think it down deep. I don't go around saying, I'm a writer.
Yeah.
Or I'm a poet.
No, I understand what you're saying. I don't think that people should, everybody should be a poet. Everybody should be a visual artist. Everybody should be, yeah, that's what I think.
If they got the time and the energy, in the case of the arts, the money to buy the various media.
The supplies, sometimes it's very expensive.
Yeah. But you know, you can always you know, you can get some pencil crayons or whatever and you can even work on lined sheets like 8.5 by 11 stuff.
Yeah.
It's actually not
well,
that
that's
expensive.
what I used to do when I was young. I'd do my art just on whatever paper was around.
So, yeah. Now, where you run across this is in blurbs. At once, A and B, and then there'll be of course, the A's and B's tend to be adjectives, and blurbists love adjectives. They really don't think they've done the job unless they can string, in the course of a short review, at least 2 adjectives together. You know, soft, jelly-like composition, or whatever. But they're really winging it when they get 3 or more in a row, right? Then they're going, man, that was an incredible blurb. Of course, adjectives are the sign of insincerity to a large extent. The more adjectives you per word that you put into a piece, the more I, judging that piece, detect or think I detect insincerity. Anyway, Robert Kroetsch, I was disappointed. He's a public intellectual. He's a literary criticism type of philosopher type of thing. Awful stuff. And so, yeah, I suppose he's in a position to kind of judge the stuff I was doing when I was a novice neophyte. But it wasn't too far down the road, like maybe a year later, I already was technically better than him. I didn't have the sophistication to throw in there. I was 22 years old. What has a person experienced when they're 22 years old? It wasn't for years until I experienced someone close to me dying, with the exception of my grandparents. So, I don't know. I'm really disappointed. Maybe don't even bother buying this if you see it around there going for a very cheap price. Used. Definitely do not buy it new. I bought it because I kind of knew the guy. I had my brush with things. But no, he's no different from the run-of-the-mill Canadian poet, really. He might be a little bit more educated or whatever. I mean, another thing that doesn't impress me, he's taught for a while at the University of Manitoba. And that might have been his default setting. What he did, I suspect after he retired, is he got another Canadian poet into a particular program. I'm not going to mention which one it is. With the person only had no background really in this field, strictly speaking. Had a degree in creative writing, a master's, and a BA from the University of Lethbridge. So, what is that? It's nepotism, which is a form of corruption. This is what they do. They hang together and they take care of their own. And the sad thing is, it's at our expense. It's at the expense of me. It's at the expense of Pauline. And maybe most important, at the expense of our wee little chihuahuas. So, yeah, there we go.